Good evening, and welcome to the International House at the University of Chicago. I'm Amy Chan, Director of the University Community Service Center, and we run the Chicago Studies program in partnership with the college in order to provide students, such as this evening, to connect the classroom with the community and city at large. We're here to pay tribute to Harold Washington, who is our inspiration for this evening's discussion about the dynamics of race in Chicago politics, past, present, and future. We'll hear from multiple perspectives, from those who worked for Harold Washington, from those who wrote about Harold Washington for the news, from a professor who studies African American political behavior, identity, and public opinion, and from a current Chicago politician. We'll play short clips of Harold Washington at various points this evening. We hope that hearing and seeing Harold Washington in action will help to add context to the conversation. Special thanks to Chicago filmmaker Bill Stamets and the staff of MediaBurn.org for use of the archival film tonight. All excerpts are taken from Bill Stamets' 1987 Super 8 film entitled Chicago Politics, a Theater of Power.
I think your mayor is a wonderful fellow, but I depart radically from him when he says that he would hope that I would have all the good qualities of past mayors. There are no good qualities of past mayors to be had. None, 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 none. I did not mourn at the bar of the late mayor. I regret anyone dying. I have no regrets about him leaving. He was a racist from the core, head to toe and hip to hip. There's no danger, doubt about it. And he spewed and fawned and oppressed black people to the point that some of them thought that was the way they were supposed to live. Just like some slaves on the plantation thought that was the way they were supposed to live. I give no hosannas to a racist, nor do I appreciate or respect his son. If his name were anything other than Daley, his campaign would be a joke. He has nothing to offer anybody but a bent-up tin-can smile, no background, and he runs on the legacy of his name, an insult to common sense and decency. Everything I've ever got in the world, I worked for it. Nobody gave me anything. And although I may sound abrasive, I have no malice toward anybody. I have a job to do. I've got places to go and things to do. And I approach this job just like any masterful surgeon when you have to cut out the cancer. I cut it out with no emotion. Get it out, get it out. This dominant culture may have messed up my pocket, but they haven't messed up my head one bit. So I approach this awesome job with pride. Pride in my community, pride in the ability of my community to rouse up as though they had been a sleeping giant and to recognize that there is a responsibility that they have that they cannot shirk. Nobody else is going to shoulder that burden. I believe in the powers of redemption, and I simply cannot believe in the God I worship that he would permit us to sit on this earth for 400 years, or rather in this country for 400 years, and suffer the indignities which we have suffered, piled time after time, high after high, and so heavy it has almost broken the backs of one of the most powerful people in this world. I can't believe there is no redemption. But that redemption is not going to come out in hatred. It's going to come out in positive attitudes toward our fellow man. I represent and you represent the fruit of the loom, the best this world has to offer. We've been through the crucible. We've been through the crucible. And we have come out with strong and powerful tensile strength. We are a high and good and moral people. We have no explanations to give to anybody. We don't have to explain our existence. We don't have to explain the thing that we want to, a part of the political power of this country, not to suppress anybody, but to add our good. We've come into the 1980s with an understanding that we have not just a right, but a responsibility to give the best that we have to a society. We want to give it, and we're going to give it if we have to beat them across the head and knock them down and make them take it. We're going to give it to them.
I would like to invite our panelists and moderator to come to the stage. Here to introduce them is Alan Litton, who is a graduate of the college and now a second-year PhD student in the Political Science Department. He's a graduate intern for the Chicago Studies program of the University Community Service Center and a member of the Student Advisory Council of the Institute of Politics. Alan.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening. Good evening.
Thank you. It's my honor to introduce this esteemed panel for this evening. David Axelrod is the director of the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago and a renowned political consultant. He's worked as a key advisor to leading Democratic candidates in local, state, and national campaigns. Most notably, he has served as the senior strategist for President Barack Obama's 2008 and 2012 campaigns, and a senior White House advisor. Prior to entering politics, Axelrod spent 8 years for the Chicago Tribune, where he became the youngest political writer and columnist in the paper's history, and served as the Tribune City Hall bureau chief during the Washington administration. He also worked as a political advisor for Mayor Washington's successful re-election campaign in 1987. He received his bachelor's degree at the University of Chicago. Will Burns is currently in his first term as 4th Ward Alderman of the City of Chicago. Prior to his election to the City Council, Burns served 2 terms in the Illinois State Senate representing the 26th District and was Deputy Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor to Illinois Senate President. Burns' political experience includes working as Deputy Campaign Manager for Obama for Congress 2000 and as a Community Outreach Coordinator for then State Senator Barack Obama, among many other posts. Burns received his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Chicago. Maiko Dawson is the John D. MacArthur Professor of Political Science and the founding and current director for the Center of the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at the University of Chicago. His research interests have included the development of quantitative models of African American political behavior, identity, and public opinion, the political effects of urban poverty, and African American political ideology. He is the author of numerous books, including Behind the Mule, Race and Class in African American Politics, Black Visions, The Roots of Contemporary African American Political Ideologies, and most recently, Not in Our Lifetimes, The Future of Black Politics. Jacky Grimshaw served as a political advisor for Harold Washington, as well as director of the mayor's Office of Intergovernmental Affairs and deputy city treasurer. Today, she is vice president of policy at the Center for Neighborhood Technology, where she plays a leading role in the transportation policy and programmatic efforts. She was appointed to the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee of Mayor-elect Rahm Emanuel's transition team and has worked in both state and federal government for the Chicago Public School District, and as columnist for Crain's Chicago Business. Finally, our moderator, Laurel Washington, a columnist for the Chicago Sun-Times, bringing more than 2 decades of experience as a journalist covering nonprofits and multimedia. She specializes in African American affairs, local and national politics, race and racism, and social justice. She also serves as political analyst for ABC 7 Chicago. From 2003 to 2009, she served as Ida B. Wells Barnett University Professor at DePaul University and Fellow at the DePaul Humanities Centers. Previously, she served as editor and publisher of the Chicago Reporter and as Deputy Press Secretary during the administration of Mayor Harold Washington. Please join me in welcoming our panel for this evening.
Thank you, Alan, and thanks to all of you for coming to join us tonight. It's a very special moment in Chicago history, this 30-year anniversary of a very special person. Amy, I didn't see the show of hands when Amy was asking about folks who'd worked in the administration and people who weren't in Chicago, but I'm wondering how many people weren't even born when Harold Washington was elected. Okay. All right. And we want to hear from some of you tonight because you're going to come at this history in a completely different way. This is a new show for you, and maybe you can teach us a few things. I want to just start off by I want to really make this a very engaged, relaxed conversation, not just go down the line, but I've asked the panelists to jump in and tell me what I think we need to know, not just necessarily answer the questions by rote. But I want to start out by asking all of you an opening question. I think I'll start with Jacky at the end, because Jacky's probably has the deepest and longest relationship with the man. And my general question for all of you is, when they describe that time, they talk about the culmination of three things: the man, the movement, and the moment. And Jacky, would you agree with that? And what did that entail? How did those three things come together at that special time in '82 and '83?
Well, I think Harold Washington in 1983 was the culmination of a continuum that began with, particularly when Dr. Martin Luther King came to Chicago to fight for open housing, and the way he was treated very badly by the then Mayor Richard J. Daley. And that led to really a break between the black community and Mayor Daley. You have to remember that Mayor Daley was elected pretty much like Jane Byrne was, on the strength of the black vote. And just like Daley, Byrne turned her back on the black community. And just like the reaction from the black community towards Mayor Daley, it also happened to Jane Byrne, and it gave rise to that moment when the black community once again said enough is enough, and kind of like, we're not going to take it anymore. And so the movement was that continuum. The moment was that there was the opportunity again for the black community to stand up for itself. And the man turned out to be Harold Washington, who was selected as a result of a number of community meetings, communities coming together, black community, Hispanic community, particularly progressive white community, and working to elect Harold Washington mayor.
And we were talking about this before backstage. It wasn't that Harold Washington came to, most politicians present themselves as candidates and say, vote for me. It was the other way around in this case.
Exactly. In fact, there was a plebiscite that was held by the folks who were very interested and committed to making sure that Jane Byrne was not reelected. And Harold won the plebiscite hands down. Lou Palmer had a mantra that was going on WVON that everybody was reciting, we shall see in '83. And that was all part of that current movement, that continuum, the energy that really propelled us to have a successful campaign. And hopefully, before the night's over, we can talk a little bit more about the movement of the Harold Washington campaign.
Okay. Michael, what's your take on it?
Well, I would agree, and I would really want to emphasize the degree of organization and protests that have been going on in the city for decades at that point. Fights with the Chicago Police Department, Chicago Public Housing was a massive fight in the middle 1960s with Daley Sr., with fights with the Dawson machine, and within the Dawson machine, for that matter, as people started breaking away and saying we need an independent black political voice. Black civil society was extremely organized. It worked on all different levels, from the grassroots and block clubs up to WVON and black media as well. All the parts were working together to bring together. And this was going on throughout the United States. So it wasn't just in a vacuum, but Chicago was the leading cutting edge of black politics in the early 1980s.
Do you think that's no longer the case?
I know it's no longer the case.
That's something we want to get to is future. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And Will, you were how old?
I was 10 years old.
Yeah.
And as one of my colleagues asked me, well, where were you in '83? And I was in Cleveland, Ohio, because that's where I'm from originally. But even though I was 10 and in Cleveland, the election of Harold Washington captured the attention of the country. I mean, it was something that people were watching all over the country. And Cleveland, just for the record, elected a black mayor in 1967. And so there was a lot of sort of pride about Cleveland being sort of at the forefront of that. I won't talk about Cleveland anymore because I'm a Chicago alderman and doesn't give me any votes. I should mention that I wrote my MA thesis on Harold Washington's primary election in 1982, and Maiko Dawson was my reader. And I think that Jacky and Michael get it right on. I mean, there had been so many different protests: the Willis Wagon protest of the 1960s, the assassination of the Black Panthers in 1969, that led to African Americans and progressives electing a Republican, the Cook County State's attorney, to defeat the machine. I mean, there were so many. I mean, just imagine how difficult it is to convince folks who had been lifelong Democrats to vote for the Republican Party as a way to send a message to the machine. That's how organized the African American community was. And people also forget that Harold ran for mayor in 1977, laying the groundwork for the run in 1983. I should mention as well that I had the opportunity to work with a guy by the name of Ron Davis, who died a few years ago, and he was one of the field organizers for the Washington campaign, and he trained me on how to do field. And so I met him when I was working for Barack Obama on his first campaign for state senator. So there's a real linkage between sort of the Washington era and contemporary African American politics.
Now, David, you worked on the Herald story from two sides. The first time around, you were covering it as a Tribune reporter, and then you later went to work for him as a political consultant. So talk about your perspective. Talk about this question about the man in the movement, the moment from that perspective, but also tell us a little bit more about the man and why he was the right person at that moment.
Yeah. Well, let me say a few things before I get specifically to your question. First of all, it is a pleasure to be sitting on the platform with all of you, but particularly with my friend Jacky Grimshaw as we come up on this anniversary, because I don't think there's anybody who embodied the spirit of that campaign and that movement more than Jacky did. So it's altogether fitting that she's here with us tonight. Secondly, Will,
Thank you, David. I appreciate that.
Also, Will, I want to tell you, this is probably something that you didn't know, despite all of your historical foraging, and that is that Mayor Washington, we won a Super Bowl when he was the mayor, and he did his duty, and he celebrated the Chicago Bears, but the truth is he was a Cleveland Browns fan.
Good man.
And he was a Cleveland Browns fan because of Jimmy Brown, and he so admired Jimmy Brown, and that was... So you guys were connected in ways you didn't even know. And then one other note I wanted to make, which was that in addition to all the things that have been mentioned that set the stage for the campaign, there was one other, which was when Congressman Dawson died, the congressional seat was given by Mayor Daley to Ralph Metcalf, who had been a loyal soldier in his army. And then in the early 70s, one of Congressman Metcalf's good friends was the victim of police brutality. This incensed Congressman Metcalf, who became much more outspoken and ultimately led to a break in 1976 in which Mayor Daley tried to purge Congressman Metcalf and ran a candidate against him, and the community resoundingly defeated that effort. And that was a big and important development in the evolution of this movement. And it all happened, Harold Washington was very much in the middle of all of that because he came from the South Side. He came out of the Democratic organizations of the South Side. He was, this was...
Out of Ralph's organization.
Yes. Right.
Out of what? He was part of Ralph's organization.
As was, right. I believe, his father was a precinct captain as well, his father.
Oh, yes. Absolutely. But his father was before Ralph, though. But yeah. The Third Ward.
The Third Ward organization.
Yes, absolutely.
But in answer to your question, if I can remember what it was, no. In answer to your question, yes. I knew him first as a reporter covering him, and he was a dream for a reporter because he was such a flamboyant, vivid personality. He was funny, he was bright, he was entertaining. And I remember going to see him, and this goes to this question of whether he, of the nature of how he came to be a candidate for mayor. I went to see him in the summer of 1982. I was doing a piece on the upcoming mayor's race, and it was clear that Richard Daley was going to run against Jane Byrne, and the question was, would there be a strong African-American candidate? And there really was only one name on people's minds, and that was Harold Washington. I went to see him, and he said, and he was actually reluctant, and he said, why would I want that job? He said, I've got a great job, being in Congress is a great job. Treat you like a king. You can come go as you please. He said, Mayor, that's a real job. He said, why would I want to mess my life up like that? And he said, but he said, I feel I owe it to the community. People, you know, are talking about it. And I'm going to set some goals, and I'm going to set some goals that are ambitious goals. I'm going to say we have to register 80,000 voters by November, and that we have to, I want to see $500,000 raised.
He was actually setting the goals higher than he thought.
Absolutely. He said they will never, these are goals that can't be met. Right. And when I saw him the day that he announced for mayor, he pulled me aside and said, what can I do? He said they met all the goals. But the truth of the matter is that there was something burning inside of him that was very, very clear. Harold, as I said, grew up in the Democratic organization, and I think he had deep resentment toward the Democratic organization. And he saw an opportunity to bring about real fundamental change, to defeat that organization that he felt had heaped indignities on him and others. And he seized that opportunity when he thought that it looked like it was realistic to do so. And we should make one other point, and then I'll yield the floor. And that is that in 1983, we elected mayors under a different system. It was a partisan system. What made it possible for Harold to win that primary was the fact that you just needed a plurality to win. Daley and Burns split the white vote pretty much down the middle. Right. Harold got 85% of the black vote, 21% of the Hispanic vote, negligible white votes, 8%, but it was enough to make him the nominee, and then he narrowly defeated the state representative from this area, Bernie Epton, in a rather virulent campaign based on race. Epton now, before it's too late, was the slogan. Kind of a tragedy, actually, because Bernie Epton had been a progressive on civil rights. He became the vessel for things that he didn't even believe in.
Right. Exactly.
And it was a very ugly and sad thing. But, yes, the moment was right. The situation was right. But he was an extraordinary character, and I'm not sure that anybody else could have pulled it off. But Harold, because he was a larger-than-life character in a city that expected that from their mayors, and he fit the bill in every way.
Absolutely. And a couple people have touched on the fact that he didn't necessarily, what the perception was, he wasn't necessarily coming out of this progressive wing of the Democratic Party. He was much more of a regular Democrat. Maybe he didn't feel comfortable with that. But he, in many ways, he grew as a politician through this period. And I want to ask Steve if you could cue up the multiracial, the speech where he talks about his multiracial philosophy about governing, because I think that was really important to his power, and then get you guys a comment on it.
Okay. I don't support the rights of people because I'm a politician. I support the rights of people because it's deep within me, a natural part of my own development. I am the outgrowth not of just father and mother. I am the results of 400 and some odd years of struggle, serfdom, man's inhumanity to man, a struggling group of people who are trying to not just abide, have made up their minds that they're not just going to survive, but will prevail in a coalitional basis with all other people. So it follows as night does day. That when people cry for help, whether they're Chinese coolies, or South African Bantus, or serfs in Russia, or South African held in bondage, or gay and lesbians pushed around, that I'll be there and defending them and supporting them. That's just no big deal.
Jackie, when he made those speeches, obviously he wasn't speaking from notes. Was that stuff just
Jackie wrote all of them.
Yes, that's right. I wrote every single one of them. You know, it's very interesting. I was, you know, most of the time during the campaign, I was in the office and organizing and doing things, and didn't go out a lot with Harold, but occasionally I did go out with him, and he would, you know, Laura's press office would write speeches for him. And yeah, I don't know if you've seen the Harold Washington Cultural Center statue where he's standing there and in his hand he has this rolled up piece of paper. Well, those were the speeches that Laura, et cetera, would write for him. Yeah. And he would read these speeches, and in the car, we were going to an event, he said, well, who's going to be there? What are their issues? What are they going to talk about? Or what are they interested in having me talk about? And, you know, we would just have a conversation. He would get up and deliver a speech like he had researched it for 6 years. You know, he just had the ability to want to connect with people. You know, I've been around a lot of politicians over the years. And he is the only politician that I know of that can come in a room like this. He would survey you. He would have a sense of who you are, and sometimes he would ask the questions like Amy and Laura asked. You know, how many of you are this, or how many of you are that? And from that little bit of information, he could craft a speech that would directly connect to your issues, who you are, where you are in life, and things that were important to you. And so a 5-minute conversation in the car, he will have a better speech than David Axelrod could ever write for him.
Without question.
So there.
I would have been disappointed in him if he read one of mine.
Well, what he was talking about there was sort of the fundamental philosophy about his multiracial coalition. Right. He was the first black mayor of Chicago, but he wasn't a black mayor.
In that sense.
And in many ways, I think we forget that when he was at Roosevelt, he was what I would call a pragmatic radical. So in some ways, he returned to his roots. But in addition to being a masterful politician, one thing we don't see that much today is he would be willing to say anything. So, I mean, we're talking in 1983, there's another clip where he's supporting gay marriage. So he was talking about issues that politicians are afraid of today. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 35 years ago. But he always also had his eye on how do we get from here to there. So he both had a vision that included everyone, or at least anyone who wanted to play fair, but at the same time a policy orientation that could say we have to do this, that, and the other to get there.
Well?
I think it's important to note that he was the first mayor outside of San Francisco to march in a gay pride parade. I mean, and when people talk about sort of the disconnect between African American politics and other groups, I think it's illustrative that Harold Washington was ahead of the curve. I think one of the things that's important to note about Harold too is that he was a legislator. I think coming out of Springfield and how do you pass legislation? How do you work with people who are different than you? How do you work with downstaters and other liberals or people who are machine folks? I think Springfield provided a training ground to get things done and build coalitions. And I think that if the African American community is going to elect or try to have an African American mayor of the city of Chicago, or that person is going to have to be able to build the similar kind of coalitions, because Chicago is effectively 1/3 black, 1/3 white, 1/3 Latino.
Right, but we have not been able to do that since Harold Washington. Why?
Well, I think, I started getting involved in politics in 1995, and that's when you had a number of African American politicians offer to run for mayor in 95 and 99. Part of the challenge is that a lot of the people who were incorporated into government when Harold became mayor, Richard M. Daley kept as part of the new governing establishment. There was a thing that I think Harold had done in terms of governing Chicago that we would never go back to the days where African Americans weren't going to have a seat at the table at different boards and commissions, at least a descriptive representation at the table. And I think, and the Daley administration continued to try to do that. So the very sort of base from which an African American candidate could emerge to challenge Richard M. Daley, that base was a part, in some measure, of the current administration.
It had been co-opted.
Well, I would say incorporated, because I think to say co-opt is to ascribe a value to that. I mean, I think incorporation is, because you could give, it's pretty smart politically to, if you see that these folks are part of the government, to keep them as part of the government and to recognize that you have to have a government that represents the entire city of Chicago. And I think once Harold was elected, I think that there was no going back to the old ways.
Right. I agree with everything that that Will said. I want to make one point and then respond to it. I think that one of the things that impressed me about 1983 was how positive the movement was behind Harold Washington. You know, he was about breaking down barriers. He was about fighting injustice. He was about inclusion. And what I remember so clearly is everyone with their blue sunrise buttons. And it seemed like every African American in the city was wearing that button.
It was a real point of pride.
And to me, what it said was, we are part of this community. We have a seat at the table. But it wasn't to push anybody else off of their seat on the table. It was to take, you know, the full citizenship in this city, and that's what Harold empowered and enabled. And I thought it was a very hopeful moment for this city. And I will tell you that when I was working on the first Obama campaign, the logo that we designed was a result of a conversation I had with our designers describing that Harold Washington button. And I said, I want a button that speaks to a new day, that speaks to hope, that speaks to the kinds of things that button did. So, you know, that election to me should not be cast in negative terms. It was a very positive movement, and it reflected who Harold was. I also have the the perspective of someone who worked for Daley in that '89 election, and I think it's important to, you know, the tragedy of Harold's death in 1987 was that he had won this election. The city had passed a Rubicon. People had begun to accept across the city Harold Washington as their leader. He had gotten control of the city council. Council wars were over. And his death set in motion, we kind of slid backward into this terribly bitter period of racial strife. And so when Daley ran for mayor, he had been burned very much by the '83 race. You know, they had to make strategic decisions because Byrne was very willing to play the race card. He was less willing to do that. She finished second. A lot of the elements of the community who resented the Washington election blamed him. And it was just an ugly, ugly period. When he ran, he understood that the single greatest imperative for the city in 1989 was to get past that moment of racial, just Beirut on the lake is what the Wall Street Journal called us. And so, you know, this discussion of co-opted or embraced is an interesting one to me. I think Daley understood that, and Harold understood that to govern this city, you had to relate to the entire city. You couldn't, you know, I think Harold set the terms for future mayors that, you know, you had to build broad coalitions.
Anyone wants to, Michael, you were going to
I would just say that, I mean, one of the things I think that we're agreeing on is his ability to build across groups, whether across sexuality or across racial and ethnic divisions. One of the things he also did, which I think is much harder today for reasons that are not politicians' fault, is to also to build across class within black community. So I know, for example, I had an informant in one of President Obama's first elections, and they were looking at some of the polls and say, we're doing very well among the black middle class, we're not doing very well among black working class voters. And to bring that coalition together, which Harold Washington was able to do, is much harder today. And it's one of the reasons it's much harder to bring forward either a black or Latino mayoral candidate today, because the community itself is split in multiple ways.
Well, the coalition pretty much fell apart. When Harold Washington died, there were efforts to try to keep it together through Mayor Sawyer, but those failed, and at least that's sort of my take on it. Coalition fell apart, Jackie, and it's never been rebuilt?
Yeah, well, it wasn't, I don't think, through Mayor Sawyer. The split happened on December 2nd, 1987, when the election of, the selection by the city council of Eugene Sawyer as mayor versus Tim Evans. And at that point, you know, the black community that had coalesced, and it was a forced marriage. You know, I want to make that clear. That, you know, there was, as Michael said, there were different segments of the black community that, let me put it this way. In 1977, when Harold ran, he won only the black middle-class wards. All of the black poor wards, and particularly the wards on the west side, went with the machine. When we came back in 1983, putting together the coalition, we had much more a much broader spectrum of the black community on our side. But we didn't have those politicians. The black machine politicians really wanted to stay with Jane, or their allegiance to Daley or the senior Daley, they wanted to go with the junior Daley. But because of their constituents, they had no choice. So outwardly, they would say, yeah, I'm for Harold, but they're doing everything in their power that they could to make sure Harold didn't get elected and their favorite candidate won. So when Harold passed away, and those politicians who had this forced marriage with Harold, then reverted to type and went with the white machine politicians, and that's what gave us was Jean Sawyer. And those real, true Harold Washington patriots, never forgave Jean Sawyer, could not see themselves participating in electing Jean Sawyer. And in some ways, Mike, Will brought up the Hanrahan and Kerry election. The same thing is that I think a lot of the black community either didn't vote or they didn't support Jean Sawyer if they did vote. And so we are still living with that now. The closest thing that has come to bringing the black community back together, at least in a meaningful coalition, was Barack Obama. But it's, Barack's off in Washington. He's not here dealing with the day-to-day and everyday. And so it's much more difficult to have that kind of consistent coalescing and cohesiveness of the black community that we experienced from 83 to 87.
Michael?
Just one really quick point. One of the, I think, key points of the Washington Coalition was the ability to hold black elected officials accountable. And that fell apart in December of 87. Exactly. And we haven't been able to hold officials accountable in the same way since.
Because Harold Washington had such a powerful, he had so much personal power, the power of his personality, he was sort of doing it almost single-handedly.
But there was also an agenda behind the election of Harold. I mean, there was an agenda of things that needed to be accomplished, right? So obviously, greater inclusion, access to city contracts, city jobs, more neighborhood development dollars. So instead of development dollars being focused on the center, having development occur in neighborhoods and across the communities. I mean, people don't remember that it was a Washington administration that created TIFs as a way to bring economic development to parts of the city that didn't have it. So that was an agenda that you could hold the 21 that were allied, at least formally, with the Washington administration accountable for. And then, I will tell you this, and I fill out a lot of questionnaires when I run for office. I've yet to fill out a questionnaire that comes from a coalition of African-American organizations about where I stand on African-American issues.
But you get that from other groups?
Sure. I fill out one for Planned Parenthood. I fill out one for Equality Illinois. I fill out one for the Latino community. There are all sorts of questionnaires I fill out, but I don't fill out one for the African-American community.
And build on that point, because I know you have strong feelings about what happened in the last mayoral election. In terms of there were efforts in the African-American community to come together around candidate, which were one strong candidate, which obviously were not successful.
Well, I think, there are two things. One is that Mayor Daley's announcement caught a lot of people off guard. There was not the expectation that Mayor Daley would not run for re-election in 2011. But to Michael's point, and to sort of expand on it a little bit, there are a lot of divisions within the African-American community, or sectors within the African-American community. You have clergy, you have business leaders, you have community-based organizations, civil society, African-American elected officials, business leaders, and the key is to have connections between those different sectors so that there's a way to sort of get people together to talk about the issues that are important to the community. And what you had was people who would talk in one bucket. So the preachers were over here, the politicians were over here, the business leaders were over there, and there was more discussion, not so much about whom do we choose, but the process to even go about choosing someone, because those connections had atrophied over the last 28 years. People I mean, sort of like calling up an old parliamentarian. Now, how do we do this back in 1982? And there was a real time constraint at the same time too, because there wasn't a lot of time.
Let me just say that again, that had the rules been in as prodigious a talent, as remarkable a person as he was, had the rules been in 1983, what they were in this last election, it would have been challenging. Harold won with 38% of the vote, but what he understood, because he had to go on and win a general election, and he had to win a general election again in 2000. A one-on-one primary and a general again in 87. Did I say 2000? In 83, he had to go on in 87 and win a general and a two-person primary. Is that to win, you had to put a citywide coalition together. You had to appeal to the entire city. And so, yes, it worked for the community to draft Harold Washington in 1983 because those were a unique set of circumstances. But that wasn't a formula for future success. So the notion of the community coming together and drafting a candidate who can win citywide, no, you need a candidate who can appeal citywide. And that coalition has to be broader than just one,
And
community.
what's the difference between being the community drafting and, again, is it this model, this more
Because I don't think self-consciously saying we're going to draft an African-American candidate is a prescription for winning a citywide election. Harold Washington won citywide elections. He had a great base in the African-American community, but he had broad appeal. There were progressives who wanted to see the machine politics be put in the past. The Latinos who joined his coalition and so on. He had broad appeal, and you can see why when you saw him speak. So I think that it wasn't just a failure of process. You have to have a candidate who's going to have that kind of broad appeal. Harold Washington was a larger-than-life figure with prodigious talent who was able to put that kind of coalition together.
Yeah, but David, I think Laura started with the movement, the man, and the moment, or the moment and the man. And I think what you're saying is true, but I think if today we were experiencing a moment, whatever that moment might be, it is possible to generate, the movement to go along with the moment that would project the person, I don't want to say the man, but the person, into elected leadership. And so, you're right, the hero was at that particular time the man. But I think it's also important that we think about how much Jane Byrne contributed to that moment.
There's no question about it.
For Harold to have the
opportunity. There's no question about it, but I'm not sure. Harold won, I think, 52-48 in the general election. It was really narrow.
Right. Well, we're talking about race politics, and we have
understood.
Eddie Verdoliak to thank for that.
No, I understand, but that was the Epton now before it's too late election. Bernie Epton was not a great candidate. But, my point is, though, I'm not sure that many other candidates, we could have had the moment and we could have had the movement, but I'm not sure that anybody other than Harold Washington would have been on the top side of that equation. I think Harold had, and all I'm saying is that it's not just a matter of developing the right process to develop leadership. You also have the right, the person doesn't just materialize because of the power of the movement. They have to have special gifts.
Agreed.
But I would say to your point, David, that since Harold, I don't think that there's been the intentionality about developing African American political leadership that can take that next step.
I don't disagree with that. I will say this: on the primary of 2004, when Barack Obama ran for the United States Senate, our plan for winning was a 7-person primary. We thought if we could get 38%, we could win this primary. And we thought we would have to dominate the African-American vote, and we had to do well among progressive voters on the lakefront and in the suburbs. We could put that coalition together. And we ended up getting 53% of the vote, carrying the northwest side of Chicago, where Harold got virtually no votes in 1983, including, and you all remember, those of you who were born and weren't living in Cleveland, the incident at St. Pascal's Church.
Oh my gosh.
Harold Washington, now the nominee, went to St. Pascal's Church on the northwest side of Chicago
With the vice
Walter
president.
Mondale,
Yeah.
who was the putative nominee or front runner for the Democratic nomination for president in 1984. And they were greeted by crowds that were really sort of reminiscent of the Deep South in the 60s.
Or Gage Park.
I mean, it was an
when Martin
ugly,
King was
and
there.
it was
Yeah.
national news, national news. And on the night that that Barack Obama won the primary, I looked up the precinct in which St. Pascal's Church sits, and I saw that he had carried that precinct, and I said to him, I think Harold's smiling down on us tonight. So we have made progress. We have made progress, and I do think candidates matter in that equation. But I do agree with you, Will, that I think there needs to be a greater effort to develop talent within the African American community, within the Hispanic community. You know, Harold Washington was sort of a phenomenon in that regard because he was a self-created, you know, he'd been through all of these things and he emerged as this sort of incredibly charismatic figure.
Right. So let's talk about Barack Obama, because is it true, I know I've read this, that one reason he chose to come to Chicago was because of Harold Washington.
Yes, I think, yes.
And so what is his, talk a little bit about what did that mean to him, and how did that impact the person that he became, the politician he became?
Well, let me just say parenthetically that one of my great regrets is that he never really got to know Harold, because I have absolutely no doubt that they would have become very, very close.
Did they cross paths at all?
Well, once, if you in Dreams from My Father, the president talks about having organized a community meeting to essentially complain about, I forget what the issue was, and Harold came to him. Somebody said, huh? Waste disposal. Okay. Thank you. It's like, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? I get one lifeline here. But Harold, but yes, I think he was excited.
And so Harold came to the meeting?
Harold came to the meeting, but they didn't really interact. But he was certainly aware of, and what Harold represented was a breaking down of barriers, and I think that there was an electricity, there was an excitement, there was a possibility associated with that appealed to the young Barack Obama.
Just if we could just go down the line quickly on that same question before we go to the conversation in the audience. Parallels and differences between Barack Obama and Harold Washington. Jackie.
Oh, you want me to start? Well, I think they both have a lot of charisma. I don't think, as much as I love Barack, that he has that magnetism that Harold had. But, you know, as when Harold walked into a room, you knew he was there, and I think Barack, you know, has a certain amount of that. In terms of, I think, values and worldview, I think they're very similar in the sense that, you know, they understand the need for inclusiveness in terms of making decisions, in terms of leadership. I think that they also, in terms of their governance, that you know, they have a vision. They have put their stake in the ground and they govern towards that. I think they both have had tremendous opposition. And that
racially based, would you say primarily?
I would definitely say racial-based opposition. You know, Harold had the 29, Barack has the Republican Congress.
Yes,
and
we were all about gridlock before gridlock was cool.
Exactly, exactly. So they both have had to govern, or having to govern, in Barack's case, under you know, extreme negative environment, but not being, you know, letting the winds and the waves buffeted them off course. So, you know, I think that Barack learned from Harold, and I think it has served him well.
What did he learn?
Exactly how Harold governed, how Harold, was able to deal with adversity, how Harold, didn't give up on his principles, that, Harold had a mantra that said, he was fairer than fair, and he was going to bring fairness to every corner of the city. And I think Barack understands that the multitude and the diversity of our country, that you have to govern for the majority, and no matter where they are, whether or not they voted for you or against you, whether or not they support you or not, that that is the job of the leader, and he is definitely our leader.
Michael?
I'll just make 2 quick points. One, they're both similarities, one positive, one negative. The negative one is that the racism is also tied to an intense opposition, in one case in Chicago, the other nationally, to be able to put forward a policy that helps the most disadvantaged segments of society. So it's not just the racism, but it's anything that looks like it's going to make things better for poor people. In particular, Glenn Beck would say it's reparations because it's disadvantaged, it helps, healthcare is reparations for black people, okay? I mean, so it's not just the racism, it's racism tied to making things worse for people at the bottom of society, all people at the bottom of society. The positive is organization. Movements are made out of organizations, and one of the things that I think we see parallels for the first time in quite a while is the ability to organize from the grassroots up and bring people out, to bring people, we also saw all these postmortems after 2012 election of the Republicans saying we never thought those people would come out. They came out partly because of the charisma of the president, but they also came out because there were people organizing, speaking to their issues, and organizing themselves to make sure they came out.
I would say that Harold Washington was certainly sort of a guidestone for the president. When he announced his candidacy for state senator in 1995, which is where I met him, he did it at the Hyde Park Ramada Inn, which is the same place Harold announced his campaign for mayor in 1982. So there was a conscious effort at the very beginning to, as he was introducing himself to voters in Hyde Park and Kenwood, to refer to the election of Harold Washington. I also remember during the dark days when he was a state senator and in the minority in Springfield, and being in the minority in Springfield is just a painful, horrible thing. And he had a poster of Harold Washington that was from the 1991-92 exhibit at the Harold Washington Library, and it's of Harold in an uncharacteristic Harold pose, not smiling, standing on the lakefront, and he had it framed in his office. And he would frequently look at it and talk about, well, what do you think we should be doing, or how do we get to that, and and so I think Harold provided a model of how you could build effective multiracial coalitions to work toward progressive ends in a pragmatic way. And I think without Harold Washington, there are a lot of us that wouldn't be in politics, including Barack.
Including Barack Obama. Great point. It's time to hear from you. If there's anyone who would like to step up to the microphone and ask a question or make a comment, and can I just ask you, please identify yourself and be succinct and brief so that we can get to as many comments and questions as possible. Yes.
My name is Kevin Truitt, and Mr. Axelrod, you alluded to something that I've thought for a long time. You talked about the fact that when Harold was elected, we had a different primary system. And I am of the belief that the reason that Richard M. Daley went to an open primary was because he strategically saw it as a way to nullify the black vote. Please comment.
Well, I don't know that I can't speak from knowledge as to what was running through his mind. I think there was an element that thought, as you thought, that you wouldn't have a repeat of 1983. But just my personal view on this is that it is a good thing for the city to have a system where you have to put together a multiracial coalition, because I don't think you can govern any other way. Harold understood that. I will say, we should point out that Harold got 8% of the white vote in the primary in 1983. He got 21% in 87. Mm-hmm. And he was disappointed in that. Because he said I've probably spent 70% of my time in these neighborhoods. I've been a great mayor for the whole city. And,
but David, the vote against him was less. So, you know, the
yeah, but I mean, my point is, though,
a lot of people just didn't vote, is my point.
Yes.
Vote against
him.
Yeah.
But he understood nonetheless that he had, that in order to govern, not just to win elections, but to govern, that he needed to be a leader for the entire community. And I think the system we have encourages that. And I don't think that it ensures that you'll have a white mayor elected or a black mayor elected or a Hispanic mayor, but it does require that whomever runs has the ability to appeal broadly.
Yes.
Good evening. My name is Tammy Davis, and I am the state president of the Indiana Democratic Party's African American Constituency Caucus. And one of the points that was mentioned during your discussion was that Harold Washington was frustrated with some of the things within the Democratic Party, Big D. And from my internal perspective, I see the lack of inclusion and engagement of African Americans within the Democratic political structure. So how do we, A, develop African Americans to not only run for political positions, the upfront, the public positions, but for leadership positions to ensure that our issues are brought to the table, particularly as the Democratic Party, Big D, is looking as to how they're to reach out, to get out the vote. I get emails, and so I just want to know, how do we engage them?
Great question. Well, maybe, Will, I know this is a big, important issue for you, the development of black political leadership.
Well, I think that, I mean, and this sort of goes back to Harold Washington. I mean, Harold was a member of the Young Democratic Organization. I mean, the way it worked you know, under the old days is that first you were a young Democrat, you know, and you worked a precinct, you learned how to do that, and then you know, if you were lucky, you got to get a job or you got to be elected to something. With the end of patronage, at least party-based patronage, you don't have the same kind of structures. So what I think it is that if you're a member of the Democratic Party in Indiana, I'd be happy to talk to you afterward, there are two things. One is that people have to learn how to organize, right? And there's a skill to it. People think that if you just pass out some flyers or show up someplace, people are going to do something. I mean, there are ways that there's schools on how to organize, so people have to learn that. Then you also have to learn the rules. I mean, one thing that doesn't get talked about a lot is that Sam Patch and Harold Washington orchestrated the takeover of the Cook County Young Democratic Organization, which was a huge deal. I mean, you can't overstate how important it was. They were so effective, they changed the rules because Sam and Harold took it over, and they were shocked that black folks have figured out how to master parliamentary procedure and count votes. So they changed the rules to keep them out of power. So it's very important that you both know, you know both how to organize and how to use parliamentary procedure and legislative processes in meetings to your advantage, because I guarantee you that the people who run things understand the rules and how to use them.
I have to say that in addition to encouraging candidates, and this goes along with what Will's saying, we need to encourage a whole generation of leadership to become strategists and pollsters and campaign managers, and to be honest with you, that we don't have that strata. We're just now developing that. It was mentioned I'm the director of the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago, and one of the things that I'm really eager to do is encourage young minority students to consider careers in not just become candidates, but to consider careers in the strategic elements of campaigning, and I think it's an important mission. One of the young men who introduced us tonight, Alan Linton, gives me great hope for the future.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Benjamin Field, and I'm a third year here at the University of Chicago. I'm initially from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is, you know, very different. And one of my greatest experiences here in Chicago has been getting to know and engage with the South Side. You know, it began when I was working with Rahm Emanuel's campaign for mayor, and since then, I bike down Stony Island to 72nd Street a couple times a week to attend a martial arts class. One of the things I noticed about the city is, on the few occasions I've been up on the north side, it seems very different demographically and even to some extent
You noticed that, huh? Yeah. You're a smart young man.
and even to some extent culturally. Another observation I've had is that it's very difficult to get from the south side to the north side in that the metro line here, there are two different metro systems. I can't get on the metro and work my way up there. So my question is, what could be done from a public policy perspective here in the city of Chicago to bring those two very different communities together?
Maybe the transportation experts should talk about that.
Well, actually, you know, one of the things that I'm working on right now, Laura said, "What are you doing, Jackie?" And what I'm doing right now is working on trying to expand our rail transit system in the city. Well, actually, in Cook County. So, you know, obviously, transportation is one way of connecting the communities. But more than that is that, you know, we have to, you know, the city of Chicago has a very segregated history. And what you're experiencing is the legacy of that segregated city and our real estate covenants and so forth that separated the races and to some extent has maintained that separation. Now, one of the things that I think in terms of public policy that it's changing, particularly on the South Side, is the removal of the high-rise, concentrated poverty public housing. And so now we have almost a blank slate of developable land. And as you move south from you know, Madison Street coming south, that you do see more integration going on. You know, I think the White Sox Park and the availability of land around White Sox Park, you know, gives the opportunity again for having an IIT being right there, having a community that's developed that is not segregated like it was in the past. So part of this is public policy now. You know, the city of Chicago is looking at these various zones of development and trying to bring development to parts of the city that has lacked that. You know, to the extent that it is welcoming of all races and it's not continuing any kind of pattern of segregation, I think, you know, we can move in that direction. But, you know, you'll probably be sitting up here having run somebody's campaign that has some historical significance before that actually happens. But we're working towards that.
Yes, that's a great point. And there's a long series of events. There's a series of events all this month. And is there a website that we could direct them to, Jackie?
Yes, it is HaroldWashington.com, I think. Oh, don't ask me.
Harold Washington Legacy, or we can get it for you.
Absolutely, yeah, we can get it to
the Institute if you're interested.
I just click on it. I
You
don't
know,
know what the heck the URL is.
What Will said, we don't generally do a good job of appreciating those that came before us, but there's no doubt that what Will said is true, that, you know, you said, what's the difference between Barack Obama and Harold Washington? Well, the difference is that Barack Obama got to run after Harold Washington. Mm-hmm. And Harold Washington laid the foundation, without which I'm not sure there would be a Barack Obama. For sure. And so he is, you know, I noticed the other day, I never realized this before, that because there's all this promotion around the Jackie Robinson movie, that Jackie Robinson made his debut in Major League Baseball on April 15th of 1946, I guess. 46? Was it 40, 48?
Harold Washington's birthday.
Yeah, but 47. So, so it's Harold Washington's birthday. And Harold Washington, in his own way, had as profound an impact on the history of this city and knocked these barriers down, without which a lot of progress would not have happened. So it seems to me that we have an obligation to share that story with our children. And if you want to get them interested, just show them some of these clips. Because there's never been a more charismatic politician in this town and around this country. I mean, I work for a president I love and I respect, and I think he's enormously talented. But Harold Washington was the most charismatic guy I ever worked for.
Charismatic and articulate and a great intellectual as well.
Just engaging, yeah. And you could listen to him forever, and he would have been willing to accommodate you.
Will and Michael, did you have any final words? I want to go out with one more really special clip, but just final thoughts.
Just one mistake my generation makes all the time is that we really do have to bring the history to younger people, but then we have to ask people, what's the future? Where do we go from here? And that's one way you bring people, say, the example of Harold Washington is about what were the needs of people that he saw and could embrace at that time, and we have to ask that same question of all groups, including the youth today.
I think I've said a lot. I wouldn't be in politics in large measure if it weren't for Harold Washington, because Harold Washington offers a vision for how to do politics in a way that accomplishes things for everyday people in a way that brings more people to the table. And I think the same is true for Barack. I think the same is true for Tony Preckwinkle. There are a whole host of people that came out of that movement, and that movement still is reverberating today.
And we're going to go out with a clip about Harold Washington talking about his longevity as mayor.
Oh, wow. 20 years.
In the past, you have done so much to make this community a tight-knit, wonderful, productive community. You've done so much that I'm going to get family. You've done so much, I'm going to give you all I've got, everything I've got. I wouldn't give it to anybody else. I saved it for you because I want you to have it, every one of you. You know what it is? I'm going to be your mayor for the next 20 years.
And that website for that program that Jackie's been working so hard on for the series of programming the rest of this month is mayorharoldwashington.com. Mayorharoldwashington.com if you want more information on the great programming that's happening around the 30th anniversary. Thank you very much for being here tonight. Thanks to David Axelrod, Will Burns, Maiko Dawson, and Jacky Grimshaw.
Thanks for being here, man. You're a great reflection.